At the 3,344-foot summit of Okemo Mountain stands a 60-foot tall steel structure, the Okemo Fire Tower. Out of 38 towers that once stood in Vermont, it is one of only 13 that are left standing today. It is a local landmark that has kept watch over Ludlow and the surrounding areas for 100 years, and it's been host to countless visitors that have dared to scale its 5 flights of steep stairs to its 8-foot square platform and experience the breathtaking 360-degree view. How did this century-old landmark come to be? To answer that question, we need to go all the way back to April 6, 1921. On the evening of April 6th, about 40 people met at the academy and formed the Okemo Mountain Club. They elected officers, and Dan G. Bryant became the club's first president. His first order of business was to appoint 2 others to serve with him to lay out and blaze hiking trails up and down the mountain. They set the dues at 50 cents a year, and several people made voluntary donations as plans were already being made to try to secure a couple of acres of land from the Black River Lumber Company at the very top. Mr. Bryant was given much credit for stimulating interest in and the organization of the club. It was his vision to make the grand old mountain, as he called it, a more accessible and inviting place for locals and outsiders alike. I think it's important to know that Dan was 78 years old at this time. He was still very active and had been an avid outdoorsman all his life. He served as one of the first officers of the Ludlow Fish and Game Club, was chief engineer in the fire department, and president of the Firemen's Association of Vermont, among many other things. By the beginning of June 1921, they had completed 1 trail to the summit, and thanks to Dan and the Okemo Mountain Club, excitement was building amongst the locals. Not only the newly blazed trail, but soon the opportunity to spend the night in a cabin and witness the glorious sunrise from the top of a 30-foot observation tower. Before I can go on, I'm going to have to briefly get into a little history on the state level, because, like always, they're going to stick their nose into this very soon. Vermont had a pretty catastrophic fire season in 1903, which led them to establish a state forest service. Austin Hawes was appointed as the first state forester. Poor logging practices contributed to the severity of the fires. Hawes, following the philosophy of the U.S. Forest Service, convinced state officials that if anyone wanted to go to the expense of incorporating a lookout station and connecting it to a phone line, then he would use state Forest Service funds to maintain a watchman at such a station. Hawes' proposal was accepted, and the first fire watchtower was built on Burke Mountain in 1921. Back in 1917, the legislature abolished the Division of Forestry, transferred the duties of the state forester to the Commissioner of Agriculture. At some point, W.G. Hastings becomes the chief forester. Somewhere along the timeline between the appointment of Mr. Hastings and the spring of 1922, Mr. Hastings becomes aware of the Okemo Mountain Club's plans to build a tower and a cabin at the summit of Okemo. In March of 1922, Mr. Hastings sends a letter to Dan and the Okemo Mountain Club. This is the part where the state sticks their nose in. In summary, the letter informs Dan that the state has acquired 2 acres of land at the very peak of Okemo and asked Dan and the Green Mountain Club to build the tower and put in the phone line, at the club's expense, of course. The letter states, upon completion, the tower would be deeded over to the state and be manned. Such an arrangement would not reduce your enjoyment of the use of the tower, and it would be known as the Forest Service Lookout Station, donated to the state of Vermont by the Okemo Mountain Club. The state is willing to erect and maintain an appropriate sign to that effect, giving full credit to the club for building the tower. I think that's very generous, wouldn't you say? Build me a tower, and I'll hang a sign for you. Good trade. I don't know what happened between March and July, but at some point the offer was rescinded and the club was asked to take no action until Mr. Hastings could come to Ludlow and meet with the club. I can only offer up an educated guess by piecing together a couple of comments in other articles that I had found, in that Dan offered to build the tower and a cabin, but no deed was to be handed over. In September 1922, work on the tower had finally begun. It was originally supposed to be built out of steel, but for some reason it was being built out of wood. Oh, and did I mention that this was a state job now? And to further my point, the construction was to be completed in 10 days, but in November 1922, some 30 plus days later, work was suspended until the following year due to bad weather. As for the cabin that was part of Dan's offer, well, it was believed that the state was opposed to the plan of the club having any interest in the cabin. It was a serious blow to the club, as they felt that the state had just cast them aside. The club made no further attempt to work with the state, even though they had raised $600 for the purpose of building the tower and a cabin. Well, that didn't stop Dan from fulfilling his dream of building a cabin. He would eventually secure 30 acres from the Black River Lumber Company and build a cabin. It just wasn't on the summit. It was about a 20-minute hike from the tower. They considered this their clubhouse. In August 1923, work on the tower resumes, and it is promised to be completed by fall. Did I mention that this was a state job? Work was suspended this long as funds were not available and were finally secured in August. The cabin is not expected to be built anytime soon, and the Watchman will have to stay in a tent in the meantime. It was planned that the tower would be manned from May to October. I am sad to say that Dan would never see the magnificent steel tower that we have today, as he died suddenly in July of 1928 at the age of 85. I don't think Dan could have ever envisioned what Okemo has become today, but I do think he would be very proud to see that so many people are enjoying that grand old mountain, as he called it. On a happier note, a little fun fact. A man named Lindsay Hall was one of the first watchmen to stay at the tower. He would welcome all visitors and happily share the grand view through his telescope. He would sometimes see 40 plus visitors in a week, and even played host to a class from the Black River Academy of 10 girls and their teacher. They had so much fun that day that they lost track of time, so Lindsay escorted the group down the mountain with the aid of his flashlight. In total, 185 hikers have visited Lindsay in this latest stint as watchman, and he has made offers to anyone that wanted to make the hike to the tower that he would be glad to be their escort. Let's fast forward to October 1934. It appears that the cabin has not been built yet, and there is talk of replacing the wooden structure with a steel one that would stand nearly 60 feet tall and include the building of the cabin finally. Enter the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC as we call it. They have been put in charge of building the auto road to the summit, erecting a new tower, and building the cabin. The Plymouth CCC camp has already been working diligently and has roughed in a road suitable enough to be negotiated by a tractor. By the summer of 1937, they had completed the nearly 60-foot tall steel tower that we see today. A 3-room cabin was built for the watchman. The auto road was almost finished to the summit, and a recreation site was put in about halfway between the town and the summit. It included 12 fireplaces and 24 picnic tables. Several of the fireplaces are still there today. By this time, the CCC had also built 18 different hiking trails and made improvements on the Healdville Trail. 4 ski trails were made, along with a ski jump on West Hill, and that's almost 20 years before the first ski lift was installed. And then disaster struck. In September of 1937, the CCC camps in charge of doing all the work on Okemo were suddenly closed. The townspeople were left wondering if the unfinished work would ever get done. But in August of 1938, it was announced that when the Ascutney CCC camps finished their work, they would be moved to Okemo to finish the projects there. The tower was manned until 1970. The cabin, I was told, burned down shortly after the watchmen ended their time there. All that remains of the cabin today is the cement foundation and the chimney that is still standing. As for the tower, it fell into a severe state of disrepair, and a fence was put up around its perimeter, keeping people out. In 2012, the tower was renovated, making it safe for all to enjoy once again. I was born and raised in Ludlow, and every time I am traveling north towards town, I glance up to see if the magnificent structure is still keeping a watchful eye over us. It is, it always is, and I hope it will always be. It is somewhat comforting to see in this crazy, ever changing world we live in that there is something that remains unchanged and has stood up against time and the elements. May it stand for another 100 years so the next generations can enjoy it as much as we have.